You didn't step into a simulation. There was no moment of entry, no warning, no choice. You opened your eyes one day and learned how to see, how to think, how to react, and that became reality. You weren't taught how to observe, you were taught what to observe. And from that moment on, the world started making sense in a very specific way. Now pause for a second. If what you experience is not reality itself, but an interpretation shaped long before you could question it, then something uncomfortable follows. Who is actually in control of your life? You, or the system that trained your attention, your fears, your expectations? If this is true, it doesn't change everything at once. It changes one thing first. It shifts the question from what is happening to me to how am I seeing what's happening? And that shift is where the story really begins. There is a trap so subtle that almost no one stops to question it, not because it is hidden, but because it feels natural. It feels like common sense. From the moment you were very young, you learned to trust what you see, what you think, what you feel. You learned that your perception is you, and that assumption settled so deeply that it stopped being an idea and became a certainty. You wake up, look at your life, and think, this is what is happening. You don't say it out loud, but you live as if the world you perceive is the world itself, as if your experience were a direct window into reality, not a constructed interface. That is the trap. Almost every human being believes they are observing reality directly. They believe their thoughts are reactions to the world, not interpretations of it. They believe their emotions are responses to events, not outputs of an internal model. And once you believe that, you stop questioning the observer. You only question the environment. This is why the trap is invisible. You don't notice it because it doesn't feel like control. It feels like freedom. You think, I decide, I choose, I react logically. But what you don't see is that the field of options you are choosing from was already shaped before you became aware of it. Think about how quickly you label things: good, bad, dangerous, safe, important, irrelevant. Those labels appear instantly, without effort. You don't sit down and calculate them. They arrive fully formed. And once they arrive, your behavior follows almost automatically. You move toward some things. You avoid others. You repeat patterns. You call this your personality, your preferences, your history. But here is the uncomfortable part. If you never question how those labels are created, you will never notice how predictable you've become. The trap is not that someone else is controlling you. The trap is that you identify completely with the lens through which you see. You confuse the filter with reality. You confuse the map with the territory. And because the filter feels intimate, personal, and familiar, you defend it without realizing you are defending the walls of the prison. This is why people can hear the same information, live in the same city, face similar circumstances, and yet inhabit completely different worlds. One person sees opportunity where another sees threat. One sees meaning where another sees chaos. Neither of them is lying. Both are reporting honestly from inside their own simulation, and both assume the other is wrong. The mistake is not disagreement. The mistake is assuming that perception itself is neutral. Once this assumption is in place, it quietly governs everything. Your memories reorganize themselves to support it. Your attention learns what to ignore. Your nervous system learns what to expect. Over time, your life starts to feel strangely consistent. Different scenes, same emotional outcomes. Different people, same conflicts. Different goals, same frustrations. You may even notice it and say, why does this keep happening to me? But you ask the question while still standing inside the same observing position. You look for explanations in circumstances, in luck, in other people, in fate. Rarely do you look at the one place that has remained constant the entire time, the way you observe. And here is the deeper layer of the trap. Because observation feels passive, you assume it is harmless. You think action is what shapes your life. Decisions, effort, discipline. But observation is what decides which actions feel possible, which decisions feel realistic, which efforts feel worth the cost. Long before you choose, something has already framed the choice. This is why change feels so difficult. Not because you lack willpower, but because the internal simulation is optimized for continuity. It prefers coherence over truth. It prefers familiarity over freedom. And every time you interpret the present through the same lens as the past, the system relaxes. Everything is working as expected. The moment you begin to sense that your perception might be shaping reality rather than simply reflecting it, a subtle tension appears. Something feels unstable. You might feel discomfort, doubt, or even resistance. That reaction is not a failure, it is a signal. It means you are approaching the edge of the invisible structure. Most people turn back at this point. They return to explanations that feel solid. They reinforce their beliefs. They double down on identity. Not because they are weak, but because the unknown feels like a threat to coherence. The system inside you prefers a familiar prison to an undefined freedom. And yet, once you have seen this trap, even briefly, you cannot completely unsee it. A quiet question begins to form beneath your daily routines. If my experience of reality is filtered, if my interpretation is not automatic truth, then what, exactly, is doing the filtering? That question doesn't demand an answer yet. It simply opens a crack. And through that crack you may start to notice something strange. Before you think, before you react, before you decide, something else is already at work, quietly selecting what matters and what doesn't. And that is where things begin to get interesting. There is something deciding your experience long before you become aware of it. It works faster than thought, faster than language, faster than logic. By the time you say, "I think" or "I feel," the decision has already been made. What you call awareness arrives late, almost like a narrator stepping in after the scene has already been arranged. You don't notice this because it feels like you are present from the beginning, but you're not. What actually happens is that a filter selects what will enter your attention, how it will be framed, and what meaning it will carry. Only then does consciousness step in and say, "This is what's happening." That filter is not neutral. It was built over time. Experiences, emotional shocks, rewards, punishments, beliefs you absorbed without questioning, things you were praised or criticized for. All of that trained the system. And now it runs quietly in the background, deciding what feels important, what feels threatening, and what doesn't even register at all. Think about how much of reality you never notice. Sounds fade out, faces blur into the background, entire opportunities pass through your field of vision without leaving a trace. You don't choose to ignore them. They simply never become real enough to engage with. That's not because they aren't there. It's because the filter didn't select them. This is why two people can walk into the same room and walk out with completely different impressions. One feels tension, another feels curiosity. One notices danger, another notices possibility. Neither of them is pretending. Neither of them is imagining things. Their filters simply prioritize different signals. And the most important thing to understand is this. The filter decides before you notice. You don't first observe and then interpret. Interpretation happens first. Observation follows. This is uncomfortable because it challenges the idea that you are consciously steering your life. We like to believe we see first, then decide. But in practice, the system inside you is constantly answering questions you never asked out loud. Is this safe? Is this relevant? Does this confirm who I think I am? Does this threaten my sense of coherence? Based on those answers, attention is allocated, meaning is assigned, emotion is triggered, and only after that does thought step in to justify what already feels obvious. This is why so many of your reactions feel automatic. You don't wake up and decide to be irritated by certain things. You don't logically choose which comments will hurt you. You don't plan which situations will drain your energy. It just happens. And because it happens so smoothly, you assume it's natural. But natural doesn't mean inevitable. The filter is efficient. Its job is not to reveal truth. Its job is to preserve stability, to reduce uncertainty, to make the world predictable enough for you to function. And it does that by favoring familiar patterns. What matches your past experience feels clearer. What challenges it feels confusing or wrong. This is also why change feels so strange at first. When you try to see differently, nothing dramatic happens on the outside. The discomfort is internal. You feel slightly disoriented, less certain, less reactive, but also less grounded. That's because the filter hasn't updated yet. It's still scanning for the old signals, still expecting the old outcomes, and when it doesn't find them, it sends alerts. Doubt, anxiety, the urge to return to what you know. Not because the new perspective is wrong, but because it's unfamiliar. Most people interpret this discomfort as a sign they should stop. They say, "This doesn't feel right," and go back to the familiar lens. In reality, what doesn't feel right is the filter losing its grip. And it will do everything it can to regain control, including convincing you that nothing is wrong with the way you've always seen things. There is another layer to this. The filter doesn't just decide what you notice. It decides what you think is possible. Certain ideas feel unrealistic, not because they are, but because they don't fit the internal model. Certain actions feel risky, not because they are dangerous, but because they don't align with your identity. You might say, "That's just not me," without realizing that me is partly defined by what the filter allows into awareness. Over time, this creates a closed loop. You see what confirms the model. The model is reinforced by what you see, and the world begins to feel fixed. This is where the simulation tightens without you noticing. Life becomes predictable. Not because nothing changes, but because your interpretation of change remains the same. New events, old meanings, new situations, old reactions. But if the filter is doing all this work before you notice, then a subtle shift becomes possible. Not by forcing new beliefs, not by chasing answers, but by paying attention to the moment just before interpretation locks in. That moment is brief, easy to miss. It sits between stimulus and reaction, between sensation and story. And once you begin to sense that gap, even faintly, you start to realize something important. The filter is active, but it is not absolute. And that realization naturally leads to a deeper question. If this filter has been deciding so much without your awareness, then what kind of world is it actually creating for you? And how different might that world look if the filter itself began to change? You can stand next to someone, share the same street, the same weather, the same moment in time, and yet be living in a completely different world. This isn't a metaphor, it's happening all the time. And once you really see it, you start to understand that reality is far less shared than it appears. Think about two people walking into the same situation. One feels tension in the air, the other feels nothing unusual. One notices small signs of opportunity. The other notices only what could go wrong. They leave with different emotions, different memories, different conclusions. Later, if they talk about it, it almost sounds like they were in two different places. What separates them isn't intelligence. And it's not luck, it's the internal simulation they're running. Each person carries a model of the world shaped by their history, their expectations, and the way they've learned to observe. That model doesn't just sit in the background. It actively organizes experience. It decides what stands out, what fades away, and what gets assigned meaning. The same environment passes through two different filters and becomes two different realities. This is why one person can feel trapped in a city while another feels inspired by it. The buildings are the same, the noise is the same, the routines are the same, but the internal narratives are different. One sees pressure and limitation, the other sees movement and possibility. Neither of them is wrong, they're simply living inside different interpretations. You see this clearly when you look at relationships. Two people can be in the same marriage, the same family, the same workplace, and feel as if they are living entirely separate lives. One feels unseen, the other feels overwhelmed. One believes things are falling apart, the other believes they're stable enough to ignore. The external facts haven't changed, but the meaning assigned to those facts has. This is also why advice often fails. When someone tells you, "Just see it differently," it sounds useless or even insulting. That's because perception doesn't change by instruction. You can't just swap one internal world for another by force. The simulation you're running has been reinforced for years, sometimes decades. It has emotional weight, it has evidence, it has memory. So when two people disagree about what's happening, they're not just debating opinions. They're defending the coherence of their inner world. To question the interpretation feels like questioning reality itself. And this creates distance between people even when they're physically close. Conversations turn into arguments. Understanding turns into frustration. Each person assumes the other is missing something obvious, without realizing that what's obvious is produced by the filter they live inside. This is one of the quiet costs of the simulation. It isolates without walls. You can be surrounded by people and still feel alone, not because no one is there, but because no one seems to be seeing the same world you are. At the same time, this difference in internal worlds explains something else. Why some people seem to move through life with a sense of flow, while others feel constantly blocked. Why some adapt quickly and others feel stuck. It's not that one group has fewer problems. It's that their internal simulations allow different interpretations of the same events. When something goes wrong, one person's system reads it as feedback, another's reads it as confirmation of failure. When uncertainty appears, one system treats it as space, another treats it as threat. These reactions aren't conscious choices, they're defaults. And once those defaults are in place, the world responds accordingly. Not because reality is biased, but because behavior follows perception. You approach or avoid, you open or close, you take risks or retreat. Over time, the outcomes begin to match the internal model, reinforcing the sense that this is just how things are. This is how different worlds stabilize themselves in the same environment. What makes this even more difficult to notice is that your internal world feels intimate. It feels personal. You call it my experience, my thoughts, my feelings. And because it feels like you protect it. You justify it. You rarely question its structure. But if you look closely, you may begin to notice patterns, not in events but in interpretations. The same emotional tones repeating in different situations. The same conclusions forming in different contexts. The same story appearing with different characters. That's a sign you're not just reacting to the world, you're recreating it from the inside out. And here's where the idea of being trapped at the center of a simulation becomes more than a concept. If your internal world is shaping your lived reality this strongly, then the place you think you share with others is only partly external. A large part of it exists inside you, organized around your point of observation. This doesn't mean you are isolated by fate. It means that change doesn't begin by rearranging the environment. It begins by noticing how the internal simulation interprets that environment in the first place. Because as long as two people can live in completely different worlds in the same place, the real question isn't which world is correct. The question is, what keeps those worlds so stable? And what happens when one of them starts to shift in ways the system didn't expect? There is a moment most people recognize, even if they can't explain it. It's when you decide something has to change. You make an effort. You try a new direction. And somehow, things begin to resist. Not dramatically, quietly. Delays appear. Energy drops. Motivation fades. Small complications stack up until you're back where you started, wondering what went wrong. This is often explained as bad timing, lack of discipline, or external obstacles. But there is a deeper pattern at work. This is the point where the simulation begins to tighten. As long as you move within familiar patterns, life feels relatively smooth. Not easy, but coherent. Your reactions match your expectations. Your expectations match your past. The system inside you knows how to handle this. It can predict your responses and prepare emotional shortcuts in advance. There's a strange comfort in this, even when the pattern itself isn't pleasant. The tightening starts when you attempt to step outside that loop. You might not even do anything dramatic. Sometimes it's just a subtle shift in how you respond. You pause instead of reacting. You question a familiar belief. You consider an option you used to dismiss automatically. From the outside, nothing looks different. But internally, the system notices, and it doesn't like unpredictability. The internal simulation is built to maintain narrative continuity. It wants your life to make sense according to the story it's been telling so far. When you introduce a new variable, something that doesn't fit the existing model, the system treats it as a threat to coherence. So it tightens. This tightening doesn't come as a clear warning. It shows up as friction. You feel more tired than usual. Doubt creeps in. Old fears resurface. Situations that used to feel manageable suddenly feel heavier. The mind starts offering reasons to stop. Logical ones, reasonable ones. This isn't the right time. You should wait. You've tried this before, and because these thoughts sound like you, you listen to them. What's actually happening is not sabotage from the outside. It's self-regulation from the inside. The simulation is trying to preserve its structure. It's trying to keep you within the range of behavior it knows how to predict. This is why many people say they feel like life pushes back when they try to change. They're not imagining it. But the pushback isn't the world saying no. It's the internal model tightening its grip to restore familiarity. You can see this clearly in moments of personal growth. At first, insight feels liberating. You see something new. You feel clarity. Then, not long after, everything feels harder. Emotions intensify. Old habits return with more force. It can feel like regression, but it's not. It's resistance. The system is testing whether this new way of observing is stable or just a temporary disturbance. Most people interpret this phase as failure. They think, I thought I had changed, but I'm back here again. And because they don't understand the tightening, they give up. They retreat into the familiar pattern and feel relief. The friction disappears. Life becomes predictable again. But predictability comes at a cost. The longer you remain inside the same observing position, the more narrow your future becomes. Not because opportunities vanish, but because your system stops registering them as real. Your world shrinks to what fits the existing narrative. And that shrinking feels normal because it happens gradually. This is the quiet danger of the tightening. It doesn't feel like a cage closing. It feels like being realistic. You tell yourself you're just being practical. You're not chasing illusions. You're being responsible. But underneath that language, the simulation is preserving its boundaries. It's trading possibility for coherence. There's also an emotional layer to this. When the simulation tightens, it often triggers identity defense. You start to hear thoughts like, that's not who I am, or people like me don't do that. These aren't facts, they're guardrails. They define what is allowed inside the model. And the closer you get to stepping beyond them, the stronger they appear. This is why change that actually matters rarely feels empowering in the beginning. It feels destabilizing. You don't feel like you're becoming more yourself. You feel less certain of who you are. That uncertainty is not a sign you're lost, it's a sign the old structure is loosening. But the system will try to tighten again. It will pull examples from the past. It will replay memories selectively. It will highlight risks and minimize potential. It will do all of this automatically, without malice, without intention. It's doing what it was trained to do, keep things consistent. The key thing to notice is not the content of these reactions, but their timing. They appear precisely when you stop observing in the usual way. When you interrupt the old pattern, even briefly, the tightening follows. And once you recognize this pattern, a new understanding begins to form. If the simulation tightens when you try to change, then that tightening itself is not an obstacle to avoid. It's a signal. It shows you exactly where the edges of the system are. And edges are important because they reveal something else. The closer you get to them, the more obvious it becomes that what you've been calling reality may actually be a structure designed to keep itself intact, which leads naturally to the next realization. If predictability feeds this structure, then continuing to observe in the same way has a cost that goes far beyond discomfort. It slowly trades freedom for familiarity, one reaction at a time. At first, there doesn't seem to be a cost. That's why almost no one questions it. Continuing to observe the same way feels efficient, familiar, safe. You already know how to respond. You already know what things mean. You don't have to slow down or stay with uncertainty. Life moves forward, and you move with it. But the cost doesn't appear all at once, it accumulates quietly. Each time you interpret a situation the same way you always have, the internal model becomes a little more rigid. Each time you react automatically, the range of possible responses narrows. Nothing dramatic changes, yet something subtle does. Your experience becomes more predictable, not just to the system inside you, but to the world around you. People start responding to you in familiar ways. Conversations follow known paths. Conflicts repeat with small variations. Opportunities that don't fit your internal expectations never fully register. You might say life feels stable, but what it really feels is rehearsed. The cost of this predictability is not boredom, it's compression. Your emotional range begins to shrink. You still feel things, but within a narrower spectrum. Joy becomes conditional. Curiosity fades faster. Surprise feels disruptive instead of alive. You don't lose depth overnight, but you lose flexibility. And flexibility is what allows experience to evolve. There's also a cost in attention. When the filter knows what to expect, it stops scanning widely. It looks only for confirmation. Anything that challenges the existing narrative is minimized, explained away, or ignored. Over time, this creates the illusion that nothing new is happening, when in fact, you've stopped noticing what doesn't fit. This is one of the most expensive costs because it's invisible. You think the world has become dull, repetitive, limited, but the world hasn't changed nearly as much as your way of observing it has. The simulation is conserving energy by reusing the same interpretations again and again. And because this reuse feels efficient, you rarely question it. Another cost shows up in how you relate to yourself. When observation stays fixed, identity hardens. You start to define yourself by patterns. I'm someone who always struggles with this, or I'm just not good at that. These statements feel honest, even humble, but they are often just descriptions of a limited observing position repeated over time. The longer you hold these definitions, the more the system organizes experience to support them. Evidence appears everywhere. Exceptions fade from memory. And slowly, your sense of possibility contracts. This contraction affects decision-making, not because you stop choosing, but because the choices that feel available become fewer. Certain paths don't even feel like options. You don't reject them consciously. They simply never enter serious consideration. And because you never choose them, you tell yourself they weren't meant for you anyway. That's a high price to pay for coherence. There's also a relational cost. When you observe others through the same fixed lens, you stop seeing who they are now. You see who they were in your story. People change, but your interpretation lags behind. This creates distance, misunderstanding, and frustration on both sides. You feel unseen, they feel misunderstood, and both of you assume the other is the problem. In reality, the observing position hasn't updated. Perhaps the most subtle cost is time. Years can pass while nothing truly new enters your inner world. Events happen, but they don't transform you. You move through milestones, routines, and transitions, yet something essential feels untouched. You might call it stagnation, but it's more accurate to call it repetition. The simulation isn't broken. It's working perfectly. It's delivering exactly what your observing pattern predicts. And because this delivery is consistent, it becomes hard to imagine anything else. You may even feel a quiet fear when you consider changing how you see. Not fear of failure, but fear of losing orientation. If you stop observing the same way, who will you be? How will you decide? What will anchor you? So you stay with what you know. You tell yourself it's enough. You tell yourself this is just how life is at this stage. And the system relaxes. Coherence is preserved. But beneath that coherence, something continues to press. A sense that you are living within a narrow corridor. That you are capable of more range, more depth, more aliveness than you are currently allowing yourself to experience. This pressure doesn't always come as dissatisfaction. Sometimes it comes as restlessness, sometimes as fatigue, sometimes as a vague feeling that something is missing, even when things are fine. That feeling is not a flaw, it's information. It's what arises when the cost of predictability starts to outweigh the comfort it provides. And at this point, many people make a critical mistake. They look for answers outside themselves, new ideas, new beliefs, new systems to follow. They assume the problem is a lack of knowledge or guidance. But this search often deepens the trap because it leaves the observing position untouched. If the way you observe remains the same, everything you encounter will be absorbed into the same structure. And that realization leads directly to a common misunderstanding, especially in spiritual or self-development spaces. The belief that escape comes from acquiring something new, when in fact what keeps the simulation intact is the refusal to look at where observation itself is coming from. Because the center of the prison was never the world you're in. It was always the way you were taught to look at it. At some point, many people sense that something about their experience of life is off, not broken, not dramatic, just subtly constrained. And when that feeling becomes hard to ignore, they often turn to what seems like the most natural response. They look for answers beyond themselves, spiritual ideas, teachings, practices, explanations that promise a way out. This is where a quiet mistake is usually made. The mistake isn't curiosity, and it isn't spirituality itself. The mistake is assuming that freedom will come from adding something to the system, rather than noticing what is already shaping it. When the search turns outward, the observing position remains exactly the same. You read new concepts, you adopt new language, you learn new frameworks, and for a while, things feel different, uplifted, clearer. There's a sense of movement, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the new ideas begin to function the same way the old ones did. They become part of the simulation. This happens because the filter hasn't changed, only the content passing through it has. You might start interpreting life through spiritual narratives instead of psychological ones. You might explain events in terms of lessons, energy, alignment, or purpose. And while these interpretations can be comforting, they often serve the same function as before, preserving coherence. Instead of questioning the observer, the system finds a more refined story for the observer to live inside. This is why some people accumulate spiritual knowledge, but remain stuck in the same emotional loops. The same triggers appear, the same fears arise, the same relational patterns repeat. On the surface, the language is different. Underneath, the structure is unchanged. And because spiritual frameworks often emphasize acceptance, surrender, or trust, the system can hide even more effectively. Discomfort is reframed as growth. Doubt is reframed as resistance. Questions are postponed in the name of patience or faith. None of this is wrong in itself, but it can quietly reinforce the trap. The most subtle version of this mistake is believing that awakening or freedom is something that will happen to you at the right time, after enough practice, after enough understanding. This keeps the sense of agency externalized. You wait, you prepare, you hope. Meanwhile, the observing position remains intact. Another version of the mistake is trying to transcend the mind while still using the mind to control the process. You attempt to silence thought, eliminate ego, or dissolve identity, but you do it from the same point of observation that created those structures in the first place. The system adapts. It turns spiritual effort into another performance, another goal, another identity to maintain. I am someone who is awakening. I am someone who understands this. These identities feel elevated, but they still function as boundaries. They define what is allowed inside awareness and what is dismissed as lower or irrelevant. The simulation continues, now dressed in spiritual language. This is why genuine shifts in perception are often quiet and unsettling. They don't feel like progress. They don't inflate identity. They don't offer certainty. In fact, they often feel like losing something you relied on. But the system doesn't like loss. It prefers accumulation, more knowledge, more insight, more techniques. And so the search continues. While the core structure remains untouched, there's also a comforting belief that the world itself is the problem, that society is asleep, that systems are corrupt, that external forces are keeping you trapped. These beliefs may contain truth, but when they become the focus, attention is pulled outward again. You engage with the world as something to escape, fix, or rise above. And all the while, the center of experience stays the same. This is the key mistake, confusing a change in worldview with a change in observation. You can radically alter what you believe about reality and still perceive it through the same lens. The simulation doesn't care what story you tell. It cares whether the observer has changed. When spirituality becomes another layer of interpretation, it reinforces the sense that the answer is elsewhere, somewhere higher, somewhere deeper, somewhere you haven't reached yet. This keeps the present moment framed as insufficient, incomplete, or transitional. And that framing is powerful. It shapes how you feel now. It shapes how you wait. It shapes how you tolerate repetition. The irony is that what keeps people trapped is often the belief that they are moving toward freedom. Because movement feels like progress, even when it's circular. The system is very good at absorbing new material. It can incorporate ancient wisdom and modern science alike. It can speak the language of transcendence while maintaining the same internal dynamics. And as long as the observer is not examined, the simulation remains centered and stable. This doesn't mean you should reject spiritual insight or inner work. It means that at some point, attention has to turn in a different direction, not toward what you are experiencing, but toward how experience itself is being organized. Because the moment you stop looking for an exit in the world or in ideas, something unexpected begins to appear. A sense that the structure you're trying to escape isn't actually surrounding you, and that realization opens the door to a far more unsettling and powerful possibility, that you're not just inside the simulation, observing it from within, that you may, in fact, be standing at its center. At some point, the whole idea begins to turn inside out. Up until now, it may have felt like you were moving through a system, trapped within layers you didn't design. A structure around you, rules imposed from the outside. But when you look more carefully at how experience actually forms, a different picture starts to emerge. The simulation isn't something you're walking around inside of. It's something that organizes itself around you. Every moment you experience has a center point, not a physical location, but a point of reference. Sensations appear there. Thoughts arise there. Meaning gathers there. And that point has been constant your entire life. No matter where you went, no matter what changed, experience always unfolded from the same place. You. This doesn't mean you consciously create everything that happens. It means that whatever happens only becomes real to you through your point of observation. The world doesn't show up raw. It shows up interpreted, filtered, framed around what you are ready to notice. In that sense, the simulation isn't a container, it's a projection. Not in the sense of fantasy, but in the sense of organization. Like a field that arranges itself around a central reference, and that reference is your observing position. This is why the world seems to respond so precisely to how you relate to it. When you expect resistance, you find it. When you anticipate threat, signals of danger appear everywhere. When you carry openness, different possibilities register. The environment hasn't changed, but the center from which it's being experienced has shifted. Once you see this, the idea of escape starts to feel misguided. You can't leave something that is generated around you. There is no outside edge to run toward. Every attempt to escape just recreates the same structure from a different angle. This is unsettling at first. It removes the comfort of imagining a hidden exit somewhere beyond your current awareness. But it also returns something important to you, agency at the level where experience is actually formed. If you are the center, then the simulation's stability depends on you remaining predictable. It depends on you observing, interpreting, and reacting in familiar ways. The moment you stop doing that, even subtly, the entire field begins to reorganize. Not because you force it to, but because it has no choice. This helps explain why small internal shifts can sometimes lead to disproportionate changes in experience. A change in how you listen alters a conversation. A pause before reacting changes the emotional tone of a room. A moment of curiosity transforms what would have been a threat into information. These aren't coincidences, they're signs that the simulation is responsive, not fixed. Understanding yourself as the center also dissolves a common misunderstanding about control. Control doesn't mean deciding outcomes. It means influencing the conditions under which outcomes arise. And those conditions are shaped by observation more than by action. Action follows perception. Perception follows interpretation. Interpretation follows the observer's position. When that position changes, everything downstream changes with it. This doesn't require you to believe in anything mystical. It's directly observable. Pay attention to how your body responds when you interpret a situation as hostile versus neutral. Notice how your options expand or contract based on the story you tell yourself about what's happening. These shifts happen instantly, without effort. The center you occupy is not a thing you can see, it's not an object. It's the place from which seeing happens, and because it's so close, so intimate, it's usually overlooked. You look through it, not at it. This is why the simulation feels external. You're always focused on what appears, not on the position from which it appears. But once you recognize that position as active, not passive, something fundamental changes. You stop waiting for the world to release you. You stop searching for a door that isn't there. Instead, you begin to notice how experience rearranges itself in response to subtle internal movements. This is also why this understanding can feel destabilizing. If you are the center, then there is no one else to blame for the structure of your lived reality. Not in a moral sense, but in a functional one. Responsibility returns to the observer, not as guilt, but as power. And power, when it's unfamiliar, feels risky. The system prefers you to believe you're inside something larger than you, because that belief keeps the center invisible. As long as you see yourself as a character moving through a fixed environment, the simulation remains stable. But when you begin to sense that the environment is organized around your point of view, predictability breaks down, and predictability is what the system relies on. This brings us to a critical threshold. If you are the center of the simulation, then changing the way you observe is not just self-reflection. It's an intervention, a disruption, something the system cannot easily anticipate. And that leads to a question the structure doesn't like. If the simulation responds to patterns, what happens when observation itself stops following the old pattern, even for a moment, without reacting, without correcting, without trying to control what comes next? Every system is built on patterns. It doesn't matter whether it's biological, social, or psychological. Patterns are what allow prediction, and prediction is what allows control. As long as your behavior follows familiar sequences, the system around you stays stable. It knows what comes next. This is why most change attempts fail quietly. They try to replace one pattern with another. New habits, new beliefs, new goals. On the surface, it looks different. Underneath, the structure remains predictable. The system adjusts, it adapts, it incorporates the change and continues. But there is one move it can't anticipate. That move isn't dramatic, it isn't rebellious, it doesn't announce itself, it doesn't even look like a move at all. From the outside, nothing seems to change. From the inside, everything does. The move is this: observing without immediately reacting. The system expects reaction. It's built around it. Stimulus leads to interpretation. Interpretation leads to emotion. Emotion leads to behavior. This sequence has been rehearsed for years. When something happens, the system already knows which internal levers to pull. But when you pause, even briefly, and allow the experience to be present without naming it, judging it, or acting on it, the sequence breaks. Not because you force it to stop, but because it loses traction. In that moment, the system searches for the next step and doesn't find it. There's no familiar hook, no automatic conclusion, no immediate identity response, and that gap, however small, is unpredictable. Most people underestimate how powerful that gap is because it feels empty. It feels like nothing. But in systems built on patterns, nothing is disruptive. When you observe without reacting, the filter doesn't know what to prioritize. Attention widens, sensation becomes more detailed, thought slows or becomes less authoritative. You're still present, but you're not performing your usual role. This is deeply unsettling for the simulation. It will try to close the gap quickly. It might flood you with thoughts, urgency, discomfort, the need to decide, explain, or fix. This is not a sign that something is wrong. It's the system attempting to restore predictability. Most people give in at this point. They interpret the discomfort as a cue to act, to think harder, to do something, and the system relaxes. The pattern resumes. But if you stay with the observation gently, without effort, something unusual happens. The experience begins to reorganize on its own. Emotions shift without being managed. Insights appear without being forced. The situation reveals more nuance than the initial interpretation allowed. This isn't magic. It's what happens when the system no longer dictates the outcome in advance. The key is that this move doesn't create a new pattern. The moment it becomes a technique, the system learns it. It predicts it. It neutralizes it. That's why repetition done mechanically loses its effect. The unpredictability comes from sincerity, from not knowing what will happen next and allowing that not knowing to remain. This is difficult, especially for people who value control, understanding, or progress. The system inside you has been trained to reduce uncertainty as quickly as possible. It equates clarity with safety. So when you don't immediately resolve experience, it signals danger. But if you look closely, the danger isn't in the experience itself. It's in the loss of the old reference point. This is why the move feels simple but not easy. It asks you to stay present without leaning on interpretation, to feel without explaining, to notice without correcting, to let experience breathe. In that space, you're no longer feeding the simulation with the data it expects. You're not confirming the old narrative. You're not reinforcing the identity response. And without those inputs, the system can't maintain its usual structure. This doesn't mean everything suddenly changes. Often, the external situation remains the same. What changes is your relationship to it. And that shift alone alters the entire field of interaction. People respond differently. Options appear where there were none. Tension dissolves or becomes clearer. You act from a place that wasn't available before, not because you planned it, but because it emerged naturally. The system cannot predict this because it relies on past patterns to model the future. When you step out of pattern without stepping into another, prediction fails. That failure is not dramatic. It's quiet, but it's consequential. And here's the part that matters most. This move can't be sustained by force. The moment you try to hold onto it, to make it permanent, it becomes another pattern. The system regains control. This is why so few people can maintain this shift, not because it's complex, but because it offers no identity, no guarantee, no stable ground. It asks you to remain alert, present, and willing to not know. And that brings us to the next tension. If the system can't predict this move, it will try something else instead. It will try to pull you back into familiarity, comfort, and automatic observation. Not all at once, slowly, persuasively, in ways that feel reasonable. Because understanding the move is one thing. Staying with it moment after moment, as the system tries to reclaim its center, is something else entirely. At first, the shift feels subtle, almost disappointing. There's no explosion, no clear milestone, no moment you can point to and say, now I'm different. Instead, there's just a quieter way of being with experience, less automatic, less rushed, and for a brief time that feels like relief. Then the pull begins. Few people sustain this change not because it's too complex, but because it removes something the system has relied on for a long time. It removes certainty. It removes the familiar sense of control that comes from reacting quickly and knowing who you are in each situation. The old way of observing had a rhythm. Even when life was uncomfortable, it was predictable. You knew how to think, how to feel, how to explain yourself to yourself. When that rhythm loosens, there's a gap, and in that gap, the system becomes restless. It starts offering reasons to return, subtle ones at first. This is taking too much energy. You're overthinking this. You should just be normal. These thoughts don't feel hostile, they feel practical, sensible, and that's what makes them effective. Sustaining the change means tolerating a kind of quiet disorientation. You're no longer reacting automatically, but you're also not operating from a new script. You don't know in advance how you'll respond. And for a nervous system trained on prediction, that feels unsafe. This is where most people unconsciously revert. They don't make a decision to go back. They simply slip. One reaction at a time, one familiar interpretation, one old emotional shortcut. And because the return brings relief, it feels like stability, not retreat. Another reason few sustain the change is that it doesn't give you an identity to hold on to. There's no clear label for someone who is simply observing without clinging. You can't easily build a story around it, and without a story, the mind feels unanchored. Humans are deeply attached to narrative. We use it to explain ourselves, justify our actions, and locate our place in the world. When observation becomes open and flexible, the story weakens, not completely, but enough to feel unstable. You may find yourself unsure how to describe what you're doing or who you're becoming. That uncertainty can feel lonely. Others may not notice the shift at all. There's no external validation, no applause. In fact, some people may respond with confusion or discomfort because your unpredictability disrupts their own expectations. And then there's fatigue. Observing without reacting requires presence. Not effortful presence, but honest attention. You can't coast on habit. You can't disappear into autopilot for long stretches. And while this is freeing, it's also tiring at first. The system has been conserving energy by running familiar loops. Now it has to stay awake. Most people interpret this fatigue as a sign they're doing something wrong. They assume the change should feel lighter, not heavier. So they stop. They return to what feels efficient, what feels like themselves. There's also fear, though it rarely announces itself clearly. Fear of losing motivation, fear of losing ambition, fear of becoming passive or detached. These fears arise because the old system equated reaction with aliveness. When reaction softens, it can feel like something essential is fading, but what's actually fading is compulsion. Still, the system doesn't frame it that way. It frames it as loss of drive, loss of edge, loss of identity. And because humans are wired to avoid loss, the pullback becomes stronger. Another quiet challenge is that this way of observing doesn't promise outcomes. You can't say, if I do this, I will get that. It doesn't operate on guarantees. It changes how you relate to experience, not what experience will deliver. For a culture built on results, this feels unsatisfying, even suspicious. The system wants proof, metrics, confirmation, and when those don't appear quickly, it questions the value of the change. So few people sustain it because it asks for a different kind of trust. Not trust in a belief, but trust in awareness itself. Trust that staying present without forcing meaning will lead somewhere worth going even if you can't see where. And perhaps the most important reason is this: sustaining the change means letting go of the idea that you are trying to escape something. The moment you frame it as an escape, you re-enter the old structure. You turn observation into a means to an end. What's being asked instead is something quieter and more demanding: to remain here, to observe honestly, to notice when the system pulls and to feel that pull without immediately obeying it. This isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like transformation. It looks like patience, like restraint, like a willingness to stay with uncertainty a little longer than feels comfortable. And because it doesn't announce itself as progress, most people never realize what they're letting go of when they return to the familiar. But for those who do stay, even imperfectly, something slowly becomes clear. The system doesn't disappear. It softens, its grip loosens, and life begins to feel less like a script you're repeating and more like a field you're participating in, moment by moment, not because you left the simulation, but because you stopped letting it decide for you every time. So everything comes down to one simple question, not a philosophical one, not something to think about later, but something that lives inside the next moment you experience. If you are the center of the simulation, then nothing changes until observation changes. Not the world, not other people, not circumstances. Each moment gives you the same choice, quietly. Will you react the way you always have, letting the system run on what it already knows? Or will you pause just long enough to see what's happening before the story takes over? Leaving was never about escaping a place. Staying was never about being trapped. It was always about whether you remain automatic or become present. If you reach this point, write this sentence in the comments so I know you stayed until the end. I choose how I observe. And if this way of seeing speaks to you, if you want to explore this further, watch one of the videos appearing on the screen now. They continue this exploration from a different angle, and if this resonated, you'll find more there.